Wyoming Territory, autumn of 1881, just outside the town of Dry Creek, the morning frost still clung stubbornly to the grass when Hiram Tate spotted the smoke curling up behind his barn. He set down his pail of oats and narrowed his eyes. No one had any business back there, not unless they were hunting trouble or hiding from it. Hiram was not a man who rushed, but he moved fast now, rifle in hand, boots crunching over half-frozen ground. When he rounded the barn, what he saw stopped him cold. A canvas sheet stretched between a crooked wagon and a low branch, sagging under the weight of last night's rain. Beneath it, a woman sat with her knees drawn up, wrapped in a threadbare shawl. Beside her, a small boy, no older than 6, crouched close to the fire, hands extended toward the heat. The woman looked up sharply, dark hair falling over her shoulder, her eyes tired and wary but proud. "I do not want trouble," she said before he could speak. "We will go if you ask." Hiram lowered the rifle. "You are camped on my land," he said. "But I reckon you already know that," she nodded once. "There was no other place flat enough to park the wagon. I thought it was abandoned. The barn, I mean." "It is not." Hiram looked at the boy who had pulled the woman's shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I am just trying to get us somewhere safe." He studied her face. Not the kind of woman who begged, but he could see she was close to breaking. "What happened to your husband?" he asked. She hesitated. "Left 3 weeks ago," she said. "Said he was going into town for supplies." "Never came back." Hiram looked at the wagon, then at her again. "Your name?" "Vera Langley," she said. "This is my son Amos." Amos blinked up at him, dirt smudged across one cheek, his eyes too old for his years. Hiram exhaled through his nose and turned toward the barn. "Come on," he said over his shoulder. "You and the boy, you cannot sleep out here another night." Vera did not move at first. He looked back. "I said come on. That barn is dry and warm enough, and I got stew left over from last night." She rose slowly, her hand on Amos's shoulder. "Why would you help us?" Hiram glanced at the wagon, the sagging tarp, the fire that barely burned. "Because I would not stand for any man to leave his wife and son out in the cold like this." They followed him inside. The barn smelled of hay and horses, but it was warmer than the wind outside. Hiram cleared a space near the back, spread 2 wool blankets over some straw, and handed Vera a tin bowl of stew. Amos ate like he had not seen a meal in days. Vera did not touch hers until her son was finished. "You have a kind heart, Mr. Tate," she said. "Not kind," he replied. "Just not cruel." She smiled faintly at that. Over the next few days, Hiram watched as Vera tried to make herself invisible. She cleaned out the barn without being asked, helped him gather eggs, and kept Amos close by her side. The boy was quiet but curious, always watching. When Hiram worked the fence line, Amos trailed after him like a shadow, asking about tools and horses and how to tie knots. "Can I help?" Amos asked one morning. Hiram handed him a coil of rope. "You hold this end, tight now." Amos grinned, small hands tightening around the rope. Hiram stole a glance at Vera, who stood nearby, a basket of eggs in her arms. She was watching them, a softness in her eyes that had not been there before. That night, as the wind howled and the barn creaked, Vera sat on an overturned crate while Amos slept curled in a blanket. Hiram sat across from her, oil lamp flickering between them. "You got family?" he asked. "No," she said. "Just Amos. My folks passed 5 years back. Husband never cared much for staying in one place." He nodded. "I know the type." She looked at him. "You, no wife, no children." "Just this land." Vera studied the lines around his eyes, the way his hands curled around his tin cup. "You seem like a man who could be a good father." He looked down. "Maybe never had the chance." Silence settled between them, not heavy, just full. "I think Amos likes you," she said after a while. "I like him too," Hiram said. "He is a good boy." Vera smiled and looked down at her lap. The next morning she found a fresh pair of boots on the crate beside her bed of straw. The leather was scuffed but strong. Amos found a carved wooden horse waiting for him by the door. Vera turned to Hiram as he saddled his mare. "You did this," he shrugged. "Boy needs something to play with, and you were limping yesterday." She stepped toward him, unsure. "You do not have to, I know," he said gently. "But I want to." That night, Amos clambered into Hiram's lap by the fire, pointing at the pictures in an old almanac. Hiram read aloud, his voice deep and steady. Vera watched, her hands folded in her lap, something shifting in her chest. Later, when Amos was asleep, she knelt beside Hiram as he stoked the fire. "I do not know what we would have done if you had not found us," she said. He looked at her, his face lit by firelight. "You were not meant to do it alone." Her breath caught. She reached out, touched his hand. He did not pull away. "I am not afraid of work," she said. "I can earn my keep. You already have." He turned his hand over beneath hers, their fingers tangling together. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, and for the first time in weeks, Vera felt safe. And Hiram, he felt something he had buried long ago begin to stir again. Something warm. Something like hope. By late October, frost lingered until midday, and the wind came down off the hills sharp and unkind. The barn doors creaked with every gust, and the horses grew restless in their stalls. Hiram patched the roof with tar cloth and spare shingles, climbing the ladder slow but steady, while Vera stitched new sleeves into Amos's coat by the fire below. She'd taken to mending without being asked. Using thread she'd bartered for once in Cheyenne, she hadn't said much about how, and Hiram hadn't asked. That afternoon, she carried a bucket of water from the well with a rhythm that spoke of years of doing it. Hiram met her halfway between the barn and the pump. "You ever worked stock?" he asked. She shifted the bucket from one hand to the other. "Helped my father with mules when I was a girl, nothing bigger." He nodded toward the corral. "One of my mares is ready to foal. Could use another pair of steady hands if you're willing." She didn't hesitate. "I'm not squeamish." By sundown, she stood beside him in the straw, sleeves rolled and hair braided back tight. The mare's breathing had changed low, rhythmic, strained. Hiram kept one hand near her flank, the other steadying the lantern. Vera watched close, her jaw set, waiting for him to speak. "She's slow to take to strangers," he said. Vera met his eyes. "So am I." He half grinned just once and turned back to the mare. The foal came just after nightfall, slick and trembling but alive. Vera helped clear its nose, her movements careful, practiced, unafraid. When it stood too soon, and on shaking legs she laughed under her breath, a sound more surprised than joyful, but real all the same. "You've got a strong one," she said, brushing her sleeve over her cheek. He handed her a clean cloth. "So do I." She looked at him, puzzled, but he'd already turned away to check the mare. Later, while Amos slept curled in a cot Hiram had built from scrap pine and rope, Vera stood outside the barn with her arms wrapped around herself. The stars were out, sharp and cold above the hills. Hiram stepped up beside her, holding out a tin cup filled with warm milk and honey. "Helps with the cold," he said. She took it without speaking, sipping slowly. The silence between them wasn't heavy, just thoughtful. "I never expected to stay this long," she said. "I didn't expect to want you to." Her eyes stayed on the horizon. "I keep thinking he'll show up one day. That he'll come walking up the path, full of excuses." "If he does," Hiram said, "he won't find the same woman he left behind." She looked over, startled. "Maybe not." He hesitated. "You afraid of that?" "No," she said. "I think I'm afraid I'm not the same, and I don't know what that means yet." Hiram nodded slowly. "It means you made it through." They stood there a while longer, their shoulders nearly touching, the air between them warm despite the chill. The next day, Hiram brought down an old oilcloth coat from the attic above the porch. He laid it across the barn rail without a word. Vera found it later and ran her fingers over the worn seams. When Amos saw it, he asked, "Is that yours?" Vera smiled. "It is now." That evening, Amos dragged a small wooden box toward Hiram, grunting with effort. Inside were scraps of cloth, bits of wire, and a battered horseshoe. "I'm building a trap," he said. Hiram raised a brow. "For what?" "Coyotes," Amos said. "They took Ma's chicken once." Vera laughed outright for the first time in weeks. Hiram crouched beside the boy, studying the contraption. "Tell you what," he said. "You build the trap, I'll show you where to set it, but we won't use it unless we have to. That fair?" Amos nodded solemnly. "Fair?" That night, as Amos traced stars through the barn rafters with his finger, Vera sat on the edge of her cot, folding a strip of cloth into a kerchief. She looked over at Hiram, who was oiling his saddle in the corner. "You've given us more than I can repay," she said. He didn't look up. "I didn't ask for anything in return." "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." He set the saddle aside. "You staying?" She looked down at her hands, then over at Amos, already drifting to sleep. "I think I'd like to," she said. "If you'll have us." Hiram crossed the barn floor slowly, each step deliberate. He stopped just in front of her. "I'd be proud to." She looked up at him, steady this time. "Then I'll earn my place. You already have." Their hands touched briefly, calloused fingers brushing, nothing more. But in that quiet, something settled between them, unspoken but understood. Winter was coming. But they wouldn't face it alone. By early November, the wind had changed. It no longer barreled in wild off the hills, but curled low and slow through the valley, carrying the scent of snow. The air in the barn hung thick with the breath of animals and wood smoke. Hiram had begun sleeping in the lean-to beside the tack room, giving Vera and Amos more room in the loft. They never asked for it, and he never explained it, but they all understood the shape of the thing between them was changing. One morning, after tending the chickens, Vera stepped into the main house for the first time. Hiram had left the door unlatched. She stood just inside the threshold, fingers still red from the cold, eyes taking in the plain wooden floor, the iron stove ticking with leftover heat, a pair of boots lined neatly by the hearth. "You can come in, you know," Hiram said from the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a flour sack. "I wasn't sure if I should," she said. "Didn't want to cross a line." He nodded toward the stove. "Lines shift. You're not a guest anymore, Vera." She closed the door behind her and moved toward the warmth. The house smelled faintly of coffee and something faintly sweet. She glanced at the table. "I found some dried berries in the cellar," he said. "Figured I'd try baking something. You bake. I can follow directions." She stepped closer, eyeing the misshapen crust cooling on the windowsill. "What is it?" "Supposed to be a pie." She folded her arms. "Supposed to," he met her eyes. "I've got a better hand with a hammer than a rolling pin." She laughed, quiet but genuine. "I'll show you how to do it right next time," he nodded. "I'd like that." She stayed while he poured 2 cups of coffee, and they sat across from each other in the quiet morning light. Her palms wrapped around the tin cup, and for a long while neither of them spoke. "I used to sew for the hotel in Laramie," she said finally. "Before Amos was born, mending uniforms, hemming skirts, I was good at it. You still are." She looked down at the steam rising from her cup. "I think sometimes I forgot who I was. The last few years. I stopped thinking of myself as someone who could do anything useful. You've kept a roof patched, a boy fed, and a wagon moving through 3 counties. That's more than useful." She met his eyes, and something passed between them, unspoken, but firm. That afternoon, while Amos collected pine cones behind the barn, Hiram brought out 2 pairs of snowshoes he'd carved years ago from ash wood and rawhide. He handed the smaller ones to the boy, kneeling beside him. "They'll help once the drifts get deep," he said. "You ever worn a pair?" "No, sir," Amos said, fingers brushing the laces. "Then we'll practice tomorrow. Snow's coming sooner than folks think." That evening, Vera pulled a crate from beneath the wagon and spread its contents on the barn floor. Scraps of muslin, a bit of lace, a half-finished doll dress. She had pried open the old sewing tin and threaded a needle before Hiram stepped into the warm lamplight. "Amos said he wanted to give something to the new foal," she said, her fingers working smooth and sure. "He asked if I could make a blanket." Hiram crouched beside her. "That's fine work. I don't have much cloth left, just old scraps. I've got sacks in the cellar. You're welcome to them." She paused, glancing at him. "You don't mind?" "I mind you freezing." He stood again. "Use what you need." She looked up at him. "You always this generous?" "No," he said plainly. "Not until now." Amos fell asleep that night with the unfinished doll blanket tucked under his chin. Vera sat beside him, brushing hair from his forehead, her other hand resting still in her lap. Hiram lingered near the ladder, one shoulder against the post. "My father used to say a man's worth is measured by what he builds with his hands," she said, "but I think he forgot to mention what he makes room for." Hiram waited a beat. "I've had this place a long time. Never made room for much. You are now." He looked toward Amos's sleeping form. "You both belong here." Vera didn't answer, but when she stood, she didn't move away. Instead, she reached up and brushed a speck of sawdust from his collar. Her touch was light, but it held. He didn't flinch. "I'm not expecting anything," she said. "Not now, not unless it's real," he nodded. "I wouldn't offer anything less." She let her hand fall, but her eyes stayed on his. He turned first, descending the ladder without another word. But as he crossed the barn floor, there was something new in his step, steady, certain, like a man who knew which way the path bent and was ready to follow it. The first snow came quiet, blanketing the pasture with a hush that softened every sound. By morning, the barn roof bore a clean, unbroken crust, and the pine branches drooped heavy with white. Amos pressed his face to the frost-laced window of the lean-to and whispered something to himself, watching his breath fog the glass. Vera found him there, still barefoot, still half asleep. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and knelt beside him. "Put your boots on," she said. "We'll walk out after breakfast." He looked up. "You think the foal's seen snow before?" "She hasn't seen anything before," Vera said. "Let's go show her the world." In the kitchen, Hiram stirred cornmeal into a pan with the back of a wooden spoon, sleeves rolled, jaw set in quiet focus. Vera stepped in behind him, smoothing her hair back. "You always cook like it's a task to be endured." He looked over at her. "I don't see the use in fussing. Then you're missing half the point." He didn't answer, but she saw the way his mouth twitched just once before he turned back to the stove. Amos came in with his coat half-buttoned and a pine sprig in his hand. He held it out to Hiram. "For the shelf," he said. Hiram took it without question and tucked it behind the oil lamp on the mantel. "It'll keep the spirits out." "Spirits, old rancher's tale," he said. "They say green boughs keep a home protected through the dark months." Vera poured water over the dishes in the basin. "You believe in that?" "I believe in keeping watch," he said. That afternoon, Vera walked fence with him. The wire held, but one of the posts near the South Creek had leaned too far under the weight of snow. Hiram knelt and began clearing around the base. "Let me," she said, taking the shovel from him. "You hold it steady." He gave her a long look. "You sure?" "I've lifted worse." They worked in silence, the sound of metal against frozen earth the only conversation. When she straightened, cheeks flushed and hair damp with snowmelt, he passed her his glove so she could warm one hand at a time. "You're not like the women I knew growing up," he said. She slid her hand inside the glove. "What were they like?" Soft-spoken, quick to blink away. "Always looking for the nearest door." "And what am I?" He met her eyes, still standing. She didn't look away. "I had to be." "Doesn't mean you didn't choose it." She handed the glove back. "I suppose I did." They walked back without speaking. Not out of discomfort, but because the air between them didn't ask for words. 2 days later, the mare went lame. Hiram found her favoring her left foreleg near the trough. He crouched beside her, brushing snow from her fetlock. Vera stood a few paces back, arms crossed beneath her coat. "You think it's bad? Stone bruise, maybe," he said. "I'll need to wrap it and keep her off it a while. I'll keep her calm." He glanced at her. "You'll miss your sewing. She'll need a hand more than my needle does." Amos came in before supper with a pocket full of hickory nuts and a torn sleeve. "Tripped," he said. "Didn't cry." Hiram knelt to check his elbow. "That's good. Ma said you used to fight in the war." "I did." "Did you ever get scared?" Hiram tied a strip of clean cloth around the boy's arm. "Every time, but you still kept going." Hiram nodded. "That's what makes it count." Amos looked down at the bandage, then up at him. "I want to be like that." Vera watched from the stove, one hand resting on the back of a chair. When Hiram rose and turned, she didn't speak, just held his gaze. That night, the wind picked up again, scraping snow across the eaves. Vera stood in the shadows of the main room, watching the fire settle into coals. Hiram came in from checking the barn, boots wet, hair dusted with snow. "She's resting," he said. "Took to the wrap well." Vera reached behind her and held out a folded scrap of cloth. "I made something," she said. "For you." He took it, a kerchief stitched with a narrow border of blue thread. "I don't need," "I know," she said. "But it's not about need." He unfolded it slowly, thumb brushing over the tiny stitches. "You sewed this by hand. Didn't seem right to use the machine." "Hands remember more." He looked up, and for the first time there was no distance in his eyes. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." She stepped closer, and when he reached for her cheek, she leaned into it. "You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have again," she said. Hiram's voice was low. "You gave it back to me." When he kissed her, it wasn't hurried, just quiet, certain, and long overdue. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside, the fire held steady. The creek had frozen shallow overnight, just enough to hold a dusting of snow. By sunrise, the sky hung low and pewter-colored, thick with the weight of more weather to come. Inside the house, Vera stood at the table with her sleeves rolled, sorting through a bundle of dried herbs she'd traded for the week before. She set aside the ones good for steeping, wrapped the rest in muslin, and tucked them into the narrow cupboard above the stove. She'd begun to move through the house like someone who belonged there without hesitation, with quiet certainty. Hiram leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest, watching her without speaking. "You're up early," she said, not turning. He stepped into the room. "I heard Amos stirring, thought he might need help with his boots." She nodded toward the back room. "He's getting better at pulling them on himself, still forgets to tie them tight." "He'll learn," Hiram said. "He's got a good teacher." She poured hot water into 2 cups, added a pinch of dried mint, and handed him one. "You ever think about expanding the barn?" He took the cup, eyeing her over the rim. "Why? I noticed the feed sacks are stacked too close to the tack. One spark and it's all gone." He took a slow sip. "You've been thinking on this." "I've been thinking about a lot of things." They sat across from each other, the quiet punctuated only by the clink of tin on wood. "You planning to stay through spring?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing snow from the eaves. "I'd like to," she said, "if that's still something you want." He reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. "I want you here, not just until spring. For good." She turned her palm to meet his. "Then I will be." That afternoon, Hiram brought out the old plow harness and set it in the open yard. The leather was cracked, the stitching loose in places, but the structure held. Vera came out with a tin of balm and a length of wax thread. "You planning to fix it?" she asked. "Figured it's time, if we're going to keep more stock come thaw." She crouched beside him, running her fingers over the worn straps. "This stitching's from back east. I haven't seen this style since my uncle's place in St. Charles." He looked over. "You grew up there, till I was 12. Then Wyoming, then Nebraska, then back here again." She paused. "Never stayed anywhere long." "You've stayed here," she nodded. "Feels like I finally stopped running." They worked in tandem, her stitching small and tight, his hands steady on the buckle fittings. As the sun dipped behind the hills, they stood back and looked at the finished harness. "It's not new," he said, "but it'll hold." "So will we," she said. He reached for her hand and she let him take it. That night, Amos fell asleep near the hearth with his arms around a worn saddle blanket Vera had sewn into a makeshift bedroll. Hiram lifted him gently and carried him to the cot, tucking the quilt around his shoulders. When he turned, Vera stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "I've been thinking," she said, "about marrying again." He crossed the room and stood in front of her. "I'd ask you, but I don't want to put weight on you you're not ready to carry." "I am ready," she said, "but I want it to be ours, not because we have to, because we choose to." He nodded. "Then I'll ask." She smiled, slow and certain. "Not now," he said. "Not with the boy half awake and the stew burning." "I'll wait," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." They stood close, not touching, until the fire popped and the smell of scorched onions reminded them to tend the stove. She moved past him, brushing his arm lightly. It was enough. The next week, the snow deepened, and the wind settled into a steady moan through the pines. Inside, the days were marked by rhythm, mornings by chores, afternoons by mending and reading, evenings by warmth and the slow build of something shared. One morning, Hiram rode into Dry Creek to pick up supplies. When he returned, Amos ran to meet him at the gate, cheeks red from the cold. "Ma says there's a letter," Amos said. Hiram swung down from the saddle. "From who?" She didn't say, just that it was from Nebraska. Inside, Vera held the envelope without opening it. "His name was on the return," she said. "I didn't open it." Hiram took a long breath. "Do you want to read it?" She shook her head. "No, not anymore." He took the letter, walked outside to the stove barrel behind the barn, and dropped it in. Together, they watched it burn. "This is my life now," she said. "Right here." He reached for her hand, and she let him pull her close. That Sunday, under a sky that had cleared for the first time in weeks, Hiram stood beside Vera in the small clearing behind the barn. Amos held a sprig of dried sage in one hand, solemn as anything. Hannah Weaver from town read the vows, her hands wrapped in wool, her voice firm but kind. When Vera placed her hand in Hiram's, her fingers didn't tremble. "I've walked through worse to get here," she said. "I'll walk through whatever comes next with you." His eyes didn't leave hers. "You're the first thing I've chosen with both hands open." They sealed the promise with a kiss as snow began to drift again, soft and slow, like blessing. 1 year later, the pasture held 3 new calves, the barn had doubled in length, and a small herb garden grew stubbornly near the kitchen stoop. Vera kept her sewing tin on the shelf above the stove. Amos had his own set of tools, kept in a wooden box Hiram carved for his birthday. They lived without excess, but with nothing missing. Every night, Hiram lit the lamp by the window. Every morning, Vera warmed the cups and set out bread. And every day, they built a life not from what they had lost, but from what they had chosen to hold. They loved without hurry, without doubt. Just steady, like the land beneath them,